Good day, everybody. Good day, Ma'am Catherine. Today we'll be discussing about the translation as relevance. With me is Giovani Ojerio. So let's talk first about the analyst of a text. So reading the text. You begin the job by reading the original for two purposes. First, to understand what it is about. Second, to analyze it from a translator's point of view, which is not the same as a linguist or a literary critic. You have to determine its intention and the way it is written for the purpose of selecting a suitable translation method and identifying particular and recurrent problems. So understanding the text requires both general and close reading. General reading is to get the gist. So here, you or we may have to read encyclopedias, textbooks, or specialist papers to understand the subject and the concepts. Always bear in mind that for the translator, the function precedes the description. So the intention of the text. In reading, we or you search for the intention of the text. You cannot isolate these from understanding it. They go together, and the title may be more remote from the content as well as the intention. Two texts may describe a battle or a riot or a debate, stating the same facts and figures, but the type of how do you call this word, gist, and even the grammatical structures, the passive voice, all right, impersonal verbs often used to disclaim responsibility. In each case may be evidence of different points of view. The intention of the text represents the SL writer's attitude to the subject matter. So usually the translator's intention is identical with that of the author of the S1 text, but he may be translating an advertisement, a notice, or a set of instructions to show his client how such matters are formulated and written in the source language, rather than how to adapt them in order to persuade or instruct a new TL readership. And again, he may be translating a manual of instructions for a less educated readership. So that the explanation in his translation may be much larger than the reproduction. All right. So text styles. So here there are four things that we will be discussing. Okay. Number one here is narrative. Okay, narrative class is a dynamic sequence of events where the emphasis is on the verbs, or for English, dummy or empty verbs plus verb nouns or phrasal verbs, such as he made a sudden appearance. Okay. He burst in. Second here is the description, which is static, with emphasis on linking verbs. adjectives, adjectival nouns. All right. Third, discussion. A treatment of ideas with emphasis on abstract nouns, okay, or the concepts. Verbs of thought, mental activity, okay, consider, argue, etc. Logical argument and connectives. Okay. The fourth one here is dialogue, with emphasis on colloquialisms and faticisms. Faticisms, all right. Let me correct me on how to pronounce that. The readership. On the basis of the variety of language used in the original, you attempt to characterize the readership of the original, then of the translation, and to decide how much attention you have to pay to the TL readers. Okay, in the case of a poem of any work written primarily as self-expression, okay, the amount is, okay, so I suggest very little. So you may try to assess the level of education, the class, age, and sex of the readership if these are marked. The average text for translation tends to be for an educated, middle-class readership in an informal, not colloquial style. The most common variety of marked error in register among student translator tends to be colloquial and intimate. Okay, e.g., the use of phrases such as more and more, okay, for increasingly. Excuse me. Above air for particularly, okay? Job for work, got well for recovered, and excessively familiar phrasal verbs like get out of, get rid of. Okay. Other common error, use of formal or official register like disease for death, also shows signs of translationism. These tokens of language typify the student translators instead of the readership they are translating for. They may epitomize their degree of knowledge and interest in the subject and the appropriate culture. And how motivated they are rather. All this will help you to decide on the degree of formality, generality, and emotional tone you must express when you work on the text. Next here is attitude. In passages making evaluations and recommendations, you have to assess the standards of the writer. If he writes good, fair, average, competent, adequate, satisfactory, middling, poor, excellent, are his standards relative to the context absolute, generally accepted in his culture, or arbitrary? Often there is only a thin line in the critical difference between a positive and a negative opinion, which is not clarified by the middle words I have listed. Okay, I mean that refers to the order of these, this writing. Similarly, approximately the same referent may often be expressed positively, neutrally, or negatively in many languages, thus plump or fat. Okay, rondeletigress. Okay, and all these words here. Okay, as writers become more aware of their language. Setting. You have to decide on the likely setting. Where would the text be published in the TL? What is the TL equivalent of the SL periodical, newspaper, textbook, journal, etc.? Or who is the client you are translating for, and what are his requirements? You may have to take account of of briefer titles, absence of subtitles, and subheadings, shorter paragraphs, and other features of the TL house style. You have to make several assumptions about the ESL readership. From the setting of the SL text, as well as the text itself, you should assess whether the readership is likely to be motivated, okay, keen to read the text, okay, so familiar with the topic and the culture, and at home in the variety of language used. The three typical reader types of, types are perhaps the expert, okay, the educated layman, and the uninformed. You then have to consider whether you are translating for the same or a different type of TL readership, perhaps with less knowledge of the topic or the culture, or a lower standard of linguistic education. Finally, if you are translating a poem or an important authoritative statement, should you consider the TL reader at all, apart from concessions or cultural scraps to help him out? The quality of the writing. So you have to consider the quality of the writing and the authority of the text. Your two critical factors in the choice of translation method. Okay, so the quality of the writing has to be judged in relation to the author's intention and or the requirements of the subject matter. If the text is well written, either the manner is as important as the method. The right words are in the right places with a minimum or redundancy. You have to regard every nuance of the author's meaning, okay, particularly because if it is subtle and difficult, as having precedence over the reader's response. Assuming they are not required to act or react promptly. On the contrary, assuming hopefully that they will read your translation at least twice. So deciding what is good writing is, okay, deciding what is good in writing. All right. Connotations and denotations. Okay. So bear in mind, class, that whilst all texts have connotations, an aura of ideas and feelings suggested by lexical words. Okay. And all texts have an underline. Be as much as of the personal qualities and private life of the writer as can be derived from the intuitive or analytical reading of the text, or of the text rather. In a non-literary text, the denotations of a word normally come before its connotations. But in a literary text, you have to give precedence to its connotation, since if it is any good, it is an allegory and a comment on society at the time and now, as well as on its strict setting. So from a translator's point of view, this is the only theoretical distinction between a non-literary and a literary text. In fact, the greater the quantity of a language resources, okay, expended on a text, the more difficult it is likely to be to translate, and the more worthwhile. A satisfactory restricted translation of any poem is always possible, though it may work as an introduction to and an interpretation of rather than as a recreation of the original. The last reading. Finally, you should note the cultural aspect of the SL text. You should, or we should, underline all neologisms, metaphors, cultural words, and institutional terms peculiar to the SL, or the S1 rather, I'm sorry for that, or third language, proper names, technical terms, and untranslatable words. So in principle, a translational analysis of the SL text based on its comprehension is the first stage of translation and the basis of the useful discipline of translation criticism. In fact, such an analysis is, I think, an appropriate training for translators, since by underlining the appropriate words, they will show they are aware of difficulties they might otherwise have missed. Thus, you relate translation theory to something. Okay, so the process of translating. The description of translating procedure is operational. It begins with choosing a method or approach. Secondly, when we are translating, we translate with 4 levels more or less consciously in mind. Number 1, the SL text level, the level of language where we begin and which we continually, but not continuously, go back to, right? Number 2, the referential level. The referential level, okay, the level of objects and events, real or imaginary, which we progressively have to visualize and build up, and which is an essential part, first of the comprehension, then of the reproduction process, the cohesive level, which is more general, and grammatical, which traces the train of thought, the feeling tone, okay? Either positive or negative, and the various presuppositions class of the SL text. This level encompasses both comprehension and reproduction. It represents an overall picture to which we may have to adjust the language level, the level of naturalness, a common language appropriate to the writer or to the speaker in a certain situation. Again, this is generalized level, which constitutes a band within which the translator works, unless he is translating an authoritative text, in which case he sees the level of naturalness as a point of reference to determine the deviation, if any, between the author's level he is pursuing and the natural level. This level of naturalness is concerned only with reproduction. Finally, there is the revision procedure, which may be concentrated or staggered according to the situation. This procedure constitutes at least half of the complete process. So that's it, class. Okay, so the relation of translation to translation theory. So the purpose of this theory class of translating is to be of service to the translator. It is designed to be a continuous link between translation theory and practice. It derives from a translation theory framework, which proposes that when the main purpose of the text is to convey information and convince the reader, a method of translation must be natural. If, on the other hand, the text is an expression of the peculiar, innovative, or clash, and authoritative style of an author, whether it be a lyric, right? Okay, prime minister's speech or a legal document. The translator's own version has to reflect any deviation from a natural style. The nature of naturalness is discussed in detail, okay, in the exposition of the theory of translating below. Naturalness is both grammatical and lexical, and is a touchstone at every level of the text, from a paragraph to word, from title to punctuation, right? So a translation is something that has to be discussed. And to many schools and universities, it is still being imposed as an exercise and felicito with English style, where the words of the original are ignored. The teacher more or less imposes a fair copy, which is a model of his own English, rather than proposing a version for discussion and criticism by students, some whom will be brighter than he is. The process of translating. Translation is for discussion, both in its referential and its pragmatic aspect. It has an invariant factor, but this factor cannot be precisely defined since it depends on the requirements and constraints exercised by one original on one translation. All one can do is to produce an argument with translation examples to support it. Nothing is purely objective or subjective. There are no cast iron rules. Everything is more or less. There is an assumption of normally or usually or commonly behind each well-established principle. As I have stated earlier, qualifications such as always, never, must do not exist. Okay, do not exist. There are no absolutes. There are two approaches to translating and many compromises between them. First is you or we start translating sentence by sentence for say the first paragraph or chapter to get the feel and the feeling tone of the text, and then you deliberately set back. Okay, review the position and read the rest of the SL text. Second, you read the whole text 2 or 3 times and find the intention, register, tone, mark, difficult words and passages, and start translating only when you have taken your bearings. Okay, so the textual level. Working on the level, you intuitively and automatically make certain conversions. You transpose the SL grammar, okay, clauses and groups into the ready. TL equivalents, and you translate the lexical units into the sense that appears immediately appropriate in the context of the sentence. Your base level when you translate is the text. This is the level of the literal translation of the source language into the target language. The level of translationers you have to eliminate, but it also acts as corrective of paraphrase and the paper down of synonyms. So a part of your mind may be on the text level, whilst another is elsewhere. Okay. Translation class is preeminently the occupation in which you have to, or we have to, be thinking of several things at the same time. The referential level, we or you should not read a sentence without seeing it on the referential level. Whether a text is technical or literary or institutional, you or we have to make up our mind summarily and continuously what it is about, what is in aid of, what the writer's peculiar slant on it, say this words mentioned here, right? It may be the action of drugs on blood, okay? The need to detect toxic effects, the benefits of blood transfusion. Say, these words here, la pression quantitative, okay, or the large number of pupils in schools, the demand for better quality education, the need for suitable education for all. Say, researches sore and fracture, okay, or the attempt to find a substance in the body fluid that promotes urine production, the disorders that inhibit the formation of the substance, the attempts to isolate the substance. Always, you have to be able to summarize in crude J terms to simplify at the risk of oversimplification, to pierce the jargon, to penetrate the fog of words. You get an abstraction like phenomenon, okay? These words mentioning that are mentioned here, referring to a tumor becoming so large that it compresses the parishimana next to it. Okay, usually a more specific reference is desirable and the translation. The tumor swelling, deterioration, etc. Thus, your translation is some hint of a compromise between the text and the facts. The cohesive level. Beyond the second factual level of translating, there is a third generalized, okay, or level linking the first and the second level, which you have to bear in mind. Okay, this is the cohesive level. It follows both the structure and the moods of the text. The structure through the connected words like conjunctions, enumerations, reiterations, definite article, general words, referential synonyms, punctuation marks, okay? Linking the sentences, usually proceeding from known information or the theme to new information like remake, preposition, opposition, continuation, reiteration, okay, etc. Okay. So thus the structure follows the train of thought, determines, say, the direction. Okay. And a text ensures that a colon has a sequel. Okay, the level of naturalness. With all that, for all the texts except the ones you know are odd or badly written, but authoritative, innovatory, or special, where a writer has a peculiar way of writing, which has to be reproduced. So for philosophy, okay, Hegel, Sartre, Husserl. So for fiction, any surrealist, Baruch, and certain romantic writers. For the vast majority of texts, you have to ensure your translation makes sense, that it reads naturally, that it is written in ordinary language, the common grammar, idioms, and words that meet the kind of situation. Normally, you can only do this by temporarily disengaging yourself from the SL text, by reading your own translation as though no original existed. You get a piece like this, these words are quite difficult to utter. But anyway, let's continue. The passage has various misleading cognates, and you can reduce it to sense by gradually eliminating all the primary senses. Now you still have to make that passage sound natural, which will usually depend on the degree of formality you have to decide on for the whole text. But you might consider, okay, a doctrine originating in a group of Latin American clergy and proliferating among various writers and coteries, which is now just beginning to be put into practice in an authoritarian fashion under the auspices of the state. A word on naturalness, a translation of serious innovative writing. Okay. So the unit of translating class. Normally, you or we translate sentence by sentence, not breath group by breath group, running the risk of not paying enough attention to the sentence joins. If the translation of a sentence has no problems, it is based firmly on literal translation. Okay? Plus, virtually automatic and spontaneous transpositions and shifts, changes in the word order. The first sign of a translation problem is where these automatic procedures from language to language, apparently without intercession of thought, okay, are not adequate. Then comes the struggle between the words in the SL. It may be one word like sleazy. It may be a collocations like a dark horse. It may be a structure like a country's government. Who governs what? Who governs what? It may be a referential, cultural, or idiolectal problem. In any event, The mental struggle between the SL words and the TL thought then begins. How do you conduct this struggle? Maybe if you are an interpreter, a natural communicator, like I write half-heartedly, you try to forget the SL words. You deverbalize, you produce independent thought. You take the message first and then perhaps bring the SL words in. If you are like me, me referring to the author, you never forget the SL words. They are always the point of departure you create, you interpret on the basis of these words. So the translator obliges. However, the ship difficulties in translating are lexical, not grammatical. Either words, collocations, or fixed phrases or idiom. These include neologisms and unfindable words, which I deal with separately. So thus, one person's view of the translating procedure, but there is a caveat, all right? I have tended to assume a demanding that refers to just a moment. Okay, so that refers to okay, anyway, but there is a caveat, okay? So I have tended to assume a demanding and challenging SL text. One can admittedly find somewhat artificially, okay, translation problems class in any text, any metaphor. Unfortunately, there are a great many run-of-the-mill texts that have to be translated, which present a few challenges once you have mastered their terminology, which carries you through into a series of frankly boring and monotonous successors. Yeah. They become remotely challenging only if they are poorly written or just for a while. All right, so monotonous successors, they become remotely challenging only if they are poorly written, or you have to school the readership, either translate for users at a different, okay, usually lower level of language and or knowledge of the topic. Many staff translators complain of the wearisome monotony of text written in a humdrum, neutral or informal style, full of facts, low on descriptions, teetering on the edge of cliché. Certainly, my account of the translating process will appear largely irrelevant to them. Enterprising translators have to appeal to the research departments of their companies for more interesting papers, or themselves recommend important original foreign publications in their field for translations. Others transfer from, say, general administration to the human rights department of their international organization to find something worthwhile to do. Okay, so next here class is language functions or text categories and text types. Okay, the expressive function. The core of the expressive function class is mind of the speaker, the writer, the originator of the utterance. He uses the utterance to express his feelings irrespective of any response. So for the purposes of translation, I think the characteristics expressive text types are number one, serious imaginative literature. So what is that? Okay, of the four principal types, lyrical poetry short stories, novels, plays. Okay, lyrical poetry is the most animate expression, while plays are more evidently addressed to a large audience, which in the translation is entitled to some assistance with cultural expressions. Second here class is authoritative statements. What is that? These are texts of any natural which derive their authority from the high status or the reliability and linguistic competence of their authors. Such texts have the personal stamp of their authors, although they are denotative, not connotative. Okay. Typical authoritative statements are political speeches, documents, etc., by ministers or party leaders, stages and legal documents, scientific, philosophical, and academic works written by acknowledged authorities. Third one here class is autobiography, essays, personal correspondence. So what are these things? These are expressive when they are personal effusions, okay? When the readers are a remote background, okay? So the informative function, the core of the informative function class of language is external situation, the facts of a topic, reality outside language, including reported ideas or theories. For the purposes of translation, typical informative texts are concerned with any topic of knowledge, but texts about literary subjects, they often express value judgments, are apt to lean towards expressiveness. Okay, so the format of an informative text is often standard: a textbook, a technical report, an article in a newspaper or a periodical, a scientific paper, a thesis, minutes, or agenda of a meeting. Okay, so one normally assumes a modern, okay, regional, non-class, non-ideolactal style with perhaps 4 points on a scale of language varieties. So number one here, class, is a formal, non-emotive, technical style for academic papers, characterized in English by passives, present and perfect tenses, okay? Literal language, Latinized vocabulary, jargon, multi-noun compounds with empty verbs, okay? So no metaphors. Second here is a neutral or informal style with defined technical terms, and an apology for that. That is technical terms for textbooks characterized by the first person. Okay, next here class is the vocative function. What is vocative function? The core of the vocative function class of language is the readership. Okay, the addressee. Okay, I use the term vocative in the sense of calling upon the readership to act, think, or feel. Okay, in fact, to react in the way intended by the text. Say the vocative is the case used for addressing your reader in some inflected languages. Okay, this function of language has been given many other names, including connotative, okay, or denoting effort, instrumental, operative, and pragmatic in the sense of used to produce a certain effect on the readership. Note that nowadays vocative texts are more often addressed to a readership than a reader. For the purposes of translation, I take notices, instructions, publicity, propaganda, persuasive writing, okay, and possibly popular fiction, whose purpose is to sell the book or to entertain the reader as the typical vocative text. All right, so the first factor in all vocative text class is the relationship between the writer and the readership, which is realized in various types of socially or personally determined grammatical relations or forms of address. Okay, so and other variant forms such as infinitives, imperatives, subjunctives, indicatives, impersonal, passives. Okay, a first and or family names, titles, hypochoristic names, tags such as a please, all play their part in determining asymmetrical or symmetrical relationships. Right? So relationships of power or equality, command, request, or persuasion. Okay, few texts are purely expressive, okay, informative or vocative. Most include all three functions with an emphasis on one of the three. However, strictly, the expressive function has no place in a vocative or informative text. It is where only unconsciously as underlie. Most informative text class will either have a vocative thread running through them. It is essential that the translator pick this up, or the vocative function is restricted to separate section of a recommendation, opinion, or value judgment. A text can hardly be purely informative, either objective. An expressive text will usually carry information. The degree of its vocative component will vary and is a matter of argument among critics and translators, depending partly, at least, on its proportion class of universal and cultural components. The epithets expressive, informative, and vocative are used only to show the emphasis or thrust of a text. I have proposed three main types of text, and in the next chapter, I shall propose methods of translating them. Okay, so the aesthetic, okay, function. This is a language designed to please the senses. Okay. All right, so where are we now? All right, so the rhythm, okay, the rhythm, balance, and contrast of sentences, clauses, or words also play their part. The sound effects consist of onomatopoeia, alliteration, assonance, rhyme, metry, intonation, stress. Some of this play a part in most types of text. In poetry, nonsense and children's verse, and some types of publicity. Okay, they are essential. So in many cases, class, it is not possible to translate sound effects unless one transfers the relevant language units. The compensation of some kind is usually possible. So in translating expressive texts, in particular, poetry, there is often a conflict between the expressive and the aesthetic function. Okay, the poles of ugly literal translation and beautiful free translation. So descriptive verbs of movement and action, since they describe a manner, are rich in sound effect. Okay. So in nonsense poetry, the sound effect is more important than the sense. Right. So how about the metalingual function class? What is that? So lastly, the metalingual function of language indicates a language ability to explain, name, and criticize its own features when these are more or less universal. Though they may not yet exist in languages which are only spoken or have had little contact with others, there is no translation problem. However, as these items are language specific, e.g. sus, supine, okay, ablative, elative, optative, they have to be translated in accordance with the various relevant contextual factors, okay, or the nature of readership, okay, importance of item in SL, the SL and the TL text, likely recurrences in the TL, etc. Okay, ranging from detailed explanations, example, and translations down to a culturally neutral third term. Okay, so that's the end class. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you learned something.